We sadly lost GDS yesterday, who isn't able to speak, but Roger has very kindly gone from second to first today and is the founder of ProFinda, and he will introduce further. Thank you very much, Roger.
Thanks. I think I've got a mic. No, if I had to give it to you. Good morning, everybody. It's actually great to be here. Firstly, I'm actually quite amazed because at the back of the room she was mocking me for having double denim. I thought that was quite a brave position to stand in. But I'm very, very excited to be here today. Really, I thought it was pretty brave as well. I'm seeing some coffees in hand, which is great because I do kind of overshare, talk quite quickly. But I am basically going to share 20 years of working with some of the world's largest organizations, some of the unicorns of the market, working with governments and so on. I'm basically trying to condense what I've seen and listened to in some of the 20 years, and including academia, the best of academia and so on. So there's an awful lot to get through, so I apologize in advance for that. But I think this slide, actually, the title of the slide is very helpful because it sets the tone. There are two very, very important things there in that title, which is given to me to explore. The first around ecosystems, and the second one is around talent and how we're approaching it. So the first thing is we're not using the word companies, which is great because, dare I say, the construct of a company is kind of archaic. Because what is a company? Where does it begin? Where does it end? What are we all doing now? Are we walking into sort of borderless workforce? All this stuff we'll touch on. The other important part of that title is we're not saying how do we get the right talent for our company. We're talking about how do we build out towards the talent agenda. So it's a complete sort of 180 shift in the psyche. And I'm going to share it sort of as a holistic view. So I sort of thought I'd whiz through this in three main pillars. The first is the insight. So I'm going to share some interesting observations that we've seen in the market, what's been going on. I think some of these things might be familiar to you, some might be new. The second is around the three pillars. So this is the sort of construct, the tenets that we have observed that make sense. So whatever type of company you are, or whatever type of company you think you might be or could be, whether it's an organization, a network, it doesn't matter. These three pillars are the resounding sort of tenets that I think are a very, very helpful lens to understand an organization and then plan for the future. And three, I'm doing the brave thing and making some sort of predictions. So looking at if we plot the last sort of 20 plus years, and then obviously with that exponential change piece, looking at the last year and then trying to project it, what's going to happen and what's moving forward. So you guys will be familiar with things like the gig economy and the borderless workforce. So we'll touch on all that. So the first is around insight. So something I picked up actually quite recently was a staggering number, which is this. So by 2020, it's just less than 4 years away, there will be 2.1 billion professionals online. Now, if you think about the difference between Facebook and the fact that you go and like someone because they've had a muffin in Starbucks and there's a nice photo of a dog doing something cute, the superficial level of social media is what it is. There's some great stuff in there, there's some great data. But it pales in significance when you think about the incestuousness of organizations, think about the supply chain. We are all connected, we just don't know it. The reason we live in cities is because we're trying to be hustling together to find these moments of serendipity. The reason the Bay Area works so well is because there's a density of people working with the same agenda. You kind of fall into opportunities because of that. So I want to have this as a sort of the background to this sharing, because I think this is where we're all sort of having to think about and head towards. So sort of four interesting stats that I sort of have seen recently. So many of the firms that we deal with, and we're working as a firm, and this has nothing to do with our organization, which is ProFinda, this is to do with the theories and the change of the market, is that most of the many firms that we know, 43% are contingent. So there's a very, very interesting set of changes happening with the core corpus of an organization. And playing into this, we have to think about how do we leverage this talent, how do we think about this talent and their movements. The second is kind of staggering. 64% of an organization is basically disengaged. So that's 64%, and so many in the room, whichever firms we work for, whether we work for ourselves even sometimes, are disengaged with the brand. And that's kind of a frightening statistic. Many of the organizations we know, and typically this happens as you get larger, is 22%, sometimes as high as 37% are benched. So that is basically people between projects, twiddling thumbs, doing nothing. And we know this other stat. So 50% of typical workforces by 2020 will be millennials. So some really interesting backstories. Now, obviously, many of these will be known by most people in the room, but I think just as context, I wanted to set the agenda of like what's been going on. So very quickly, there's the Industrial Revolution. This is really around suddenly people could get fired, and there was some logic behind that. The 1938 was actually when there were the just like the actual stat on this is actually quite interesting, but it was around the minimum wage. That was the item. The 21st century is when HR started to actually have power in the boardroom. 75 is when information started changing the networks and how we started to move data around the markets. And then everything's changing today. So I've thought long and hard about the most useful turn of phrase around this. People talk about the share economy and so on. I think it's the on-demand economy. So everything now is on demand. Thinking about TV, it's now Netflix. We want information now, we want things now. It's a two-way street. So actually as an employee, I want to have types of work that I want to have now. I don't want to have to work in an organisation. Do you know what? I don't want to go to London. I want to work from home for 3 days a week. And it's similar actually the way around. So companies want to basically pick into talent at different times in different ways. And you'll hear the phrase, I'm sure, many times already about the gig economy, the portfolio working force and so on. So there is an entire shift happening in the favour of on-demand. And I think we have to think about this and play to it. The other sort of interesting backstory is over the past 15 years, 52, so over half of Fortune 500 companies have actually vanished. And the rate is obviously changing. And that's because we're moving into this exponential change. So an interesting stat, we evolved in the plains of Africa, sort of from 200,000 years ago, thinking locally and linearly. And everything's now global and exponential. So I'm going to do a brave quick questionnaire sort of experiment. But if you're familiar with exponential change, I don't know if you guys have heard about the 30 steps. So if a step is a meter and you take 30 steps, we all know how far we go? Somebody? Good man. Okay, so 30 meters and 30 steps with 1 meter per step. Exponentially speaking, if every step was doubling, so 2, the 4, 8, by your 30th step, does anyone have any clue how far you'd take on your 30th step? Brave guess. Someone either has cheated or they're very smart. But the fundamental principle is we just don't know. And actually, another way of looking at that is if you fold a piece of paper hypothetically 24 times, you get to the moon, and 103, you get to the end of space. So exponential change is happening. And why is that relevant? Well, because every single prediction made by the analysts, Forrester, Gartner, and so on, in terms of phones, even the phone market has been wrong by a factor of nearly 100%. So the change is happening at a staggering rate because of technology in the main. And obviously, these are just classic case studies to sort of share. But the fundamental difference is what used to happen in a business was basically build an operational model around people and then sell scarcity to that. That was the traditional business case. What happens these days, of course, is it's about empowerment. So you basically think about your internal customer, your employee. You think about your external customer, your customer, and you put them together. You get out of the way and you empower them. And obviously, Airbnb and Uber are such good examples of that. But what's the common thread? So as we start to think about building the organizations of tomorrow, there's a set of principles that I think are sort of irrefutable. There's probably about 50 items when we think about workforce of the future. As we're building about these ecosystems and thinking about supply chain knowledge and people and the shift of talent, there are about 50 items. And here's just a quick peek at just a few of them. So here's an interesting observation. How is it possible that today, still, pretty much every bit of technology that's ever been brought into organizations is management technology? It's staggering. Where's the employee first technology? Where's the Shazam at work? Doesn't exist, still. So we have to think in those terms. The second is, the 20-year focus. Companies forever think about how do we own our talent? How do we keep them around for 20 years? Well, clearly that's a sort of futile process. What we should be doing is training, empowering, incentivizing people to be so good they could leave. And I personally think that by doing that, they'll stay. Annual appraisal is another example. For God's sake, we have to rip those up. We know many firms, Adobe being one, are getting rid of the annual appraisal in favor of real-time feedback loops because the currency of trust, building up this model. We'll get into that in a moment. Another one there, hoarding information. The old world used to be about people that had amazing black books and you really were very privileged to have a chat with them and maybe they'll talk to you. It's nonsense. We're talking about the sharing economy of knowledge. That's where the value is. And again, the culture was around this sort of management, that basically this middle management that were ultimately incentivized to be blockers. You have divisional heads of organizations, we see them all the time, in complete conflict to other divisional heads. It's absolutely mad. As a result, companies are crawling along on 1 mile an hour. So they need to become catalysts and incentivized to move. So looking just quickly at the drivers of this, there are, I think, 3 main drivers. Obviously, there's technology, which is adding the exponential change. There's the globalization sort of everything. And then there's these sort of strange things called people. So already there's going to be 5 generations at work. But this is driving the agenda, I think, quite profoundly. And the employee centricity is the big play here. I want to just quickly touch on ecosystems. I will go back into this in more detail at the end of the speech, but I think this is the key thing about companies, is it's all changing. A company is what? It's not about the four walls. It is changing profoundly. And if you think about it as a challenge, as you think about the organization, but what about the contingent workforce? What about the alumni? What about the network of those? The supply chain, again, we talked about the complexities of the professional market. There is the HS2 projects. You're talking about one guy with one project. It's a big one. But we're talking about 8 major firms involved. Each of them don't know themselves. Each one of those 8 companies with thousands of companies in their supply chain. At the moment, presently, all disconnected. And that's just one project. And then obviously we've heard about the Internet of Everything. We've heard about the Internet of Things. But really it's about the network of everything. And quick plug here, but I think, take someone like Ignite. Is Ignite, surely it should be part of your company, as I think it's becoming for many people here. But this is a great example about this group here. A sort of tribe of people interested in future of work, interested in new policies and new ideas. This is how I think it's interesting how everything's moving and changing. A sort of ethos that I love from Steve Johnson about fortune favours the connected mind. We need to be around people similar to us to a point. We want to think about diversity, but we need to be around thinking about the Bay Area, this density of opportunity. And so the way that we look at this, I think, is quite a new way and quite a fresh way to look at sort of networks and companies. And it is as follows. So we appreciate the power of knowledge, the brain. We also appreciate the power of our social network. But we also need to start to really appreciate attitude. And what's interesting is, so we are familiar with IQ. We call this network intelligence. And then obviously the third about sort of EQ, the empathy behind this. And I will talk about it more in a second. But empathy is behind the virtues of people that are quite triadic. But as an observation, what's happened for the longest time is the wrong technology has gone into the organization that's horrible. Quite frankly, horrible technology. As a result, this power is divided. It's diluted by infrastructure, by culture. Ginny Robbins was talking quite famously about it's about what you share, not what you know. So actually, if we want to think about the changes, we're talking about the collective view. Your individual IQ points really do not matter. You could be the smartest PhD kid in the world, but you're sitting in a silo. It's about how we share and connect that knowledge. So we're talking about the collective view of your knowledge, the collective view of your social network, and the collective view of your EQ. And again, the other twist here is we have to stop adding and then being divided by infrastructure. We have to think the multiplying effect, and that's where we're going to get the exponential change across. So with that context in mind, I sort of want to drift into these 3 pillars that I was talking about earlier. So I think this is just probably a very useful anchor slide to then move forward on. So there are 3 main areas. It doesn't matter what type of organization you are. These 3 things that we think are irrefutable. The first is around discovery, because data is king. We get that, we know that, we've heard the phrase before. But how do you unlock that data? What's the virtue there? How do we interact with people and get the feedback loops and keep that data alive? And the third is about, we are dealing with people. And we have to think about motivational factors in order to move things forward. So if I take those 3 tenets forward, a quick touch on sort of knowledge. So this is really interesting because explicit knowledge really represents the stuff that you can codify, and it is way below 2%. So this is the stuff you've got structured data, you've got it in organizations, often it's probably a bit out of date, but it is only sub of 2%. What's really powerful is tacit knowledge, which represents pretty much all the stuff we know. So we've heard the Romney sort of thing about we know what we know what we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. Well, this represents most of the stuff. We're talking about insight and instinct. We're talking about all that incredible knowledge. And of course, what you get with this is every firm, all that churn rate, all those people leave, all that corporate memory, gone, absolutely gone. So as the ecosystem starts to evolve, we want to think about leveraging it. We have to think about putting our arms around this and empowering to keep this corporate memory. Something I find flabbergasting, again, is if we just sort of challenge ourselves in the room, is thinking about machine learning and AI. We all know it, we all understand it, but there's a massive lack of movement on this. And I say this because we're working with the world's largest organizations. We've been talking to governments around the markets. There seems to be a bizarre situation, and I can only put it down to the fact that there are so many people paid to say no. And of course, I'm sitting on one side of the table, but why are we doing this to ourselves? We are slowing up prosperity and humanity because we've got people that are designed to basically say no. We need to find creative solutions. And that's because of this. We know and we're seeing that engagement on systems is sub 5%. We can see the cost of technology that goes into organizations for every $1, $15 is spent at least in terms of installation to try to make it work, and often it doesn't. And I would say, actually, Prof, that probably 99% of opportunities are lost because of this backstory. So one quick question is email. We all know this. We use it whether we like it or love it, but every day we're all on email. We're saying so many things. We're talking to so many interesting people. You can use machine learning and AI to scan those emails to understand, not sentiment, not naughty words, but you can understand the content of those emails. Who's talking about certain brands and sectors, and actually the to and the from. Who knows? Your social network. You can build up the knowledge and the social network profoundly by just analyzing emails. It's a no-brainer. It would save large companies billions every year, but no one's actually done it. It's very strange. So relevance. So this is an amazing stat. So we surveyed over 9,000 people across a range of firms, from financial services companies, media companies, and so on. And this number emerged, and we find it fascinating. So 28 times a day, every one of us is trying to find someone or something. So just a really interesting number, because this is actually kind of a generic number that's popped out. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because take one of the large consultancy firms. I won't mention names, of course. But they spend £330 million a year in downtime just to find each other for projects and pitches. A different firm, I stress, the quality coming back doesn't just take 4 weeks, but it's at 50% optimized. And the sales value, so the missed opportunity, because of the non-optimized people and information, again, it's 50%. And 3 firms that, I won't reference names, that we know of and we love, the bench staff, so people between projects across 3 firms, the salaries alone are 17.5 billion. And this number, which is interesting, about 28, is not because of your own tribe. If we were an HR function in a bank, I don't mean 28 times you need to understand who's doing what from that group. It's outside that tribe. And that's because we've been spending the longest time thinking about how solutions. We're getting the wrong data from the wrong places. Who here has done a mass email asking for questions? Who here has picked up the phone and said, hey, Michael, I'm really sorry to bother you again, but do you know anyone that? So what we've said as an observation, which was kind of staggering, is companies for the longest time, I mean, there are literally over 100 brands and logos we could have put in the how environment there. We've got the how nailed, right? Look at your phone, WhatsApp, text messages, even this event, it's a how solution. Who's solving the who and who's solving the why? And I say this because if you put this in the context of a company evolving to an ecosystem, whatever you want to define that as, we have to think in context of this, because we're talking about growing masses of people that don't know each other. So how many people in this room have actually, I mean, we might start to meet each other at different events across the years, but we don't really know each other that well. So what I'll be talking about in a moment is the motivational factors to start to create across borders, across ecosystems, the motivations to want to connect. So just to put that in perspective, think about a firm. There's a made-up person called Michael. We think about his attitude, what he knows and who he knows. His firm's 22,000 people. He knows 50 people. He's been there for 5 years. And he knows of 150. But his firm's 22,000. And then actually what's also really interesting is their contingent alumni, 57,000 people. And the network of all that company is over, there's nearly 150 million people that desperately don't know each other. So this is one view of an ecosystem as it evolves that we don't even define yet, but we need to think about. And this is one of the tricks in the toolkit, I think, in order as we start to evolve. This is really important stuff, the currency of trust. So we are very tribal. We think about the old Corporation of London. It's like, giving someone wool and trading it for gold. There's a quality of trust. We can quickly lose that, especially as obviously the borders start to change. So why is it that I'll go to a random hotel in Greece because 3,000 strangers have said it's great? It's because they're 3,000 strangers, and it's because I don't need to meet them, but because they're building a currency of trust. If it was 5 people, I would be convinced myself to think it's probably the hotel owner, his wife, and a few friends. But when you get to 3,000, it gets really interesting. So the sharing economy is a great example of that. But think about organizations. We are interacting with each other every single day on emails and IM messaging systems and events, but we don't capture this sort of insight. So what we're finding in the workforce as it evolves, of course, is that we're seeing more projects take place, they're happening faster, and geography becomes less and less relevant. And if you think about trust, some amazing stats here, 49% of us only trust our bosses. And I'm thinking myself, as a boss, that could be a problem, so I'll have to address this. And 46% trust the company. So we've got a massive gap here. There's something broken that we need to think into. So what I've offered up is, again, this is sort of 20 years sharing in one sort of slide, but essentially, these are the items that when we think about corporates, it's worked perfectly and very, very well for the sharing economy, for the B2C solutions that we use. But essentially, we've got to invest in transparency, especially as ecosystems become wider and more amorphous. When we think about profile sharing, so the social qualities online and offline, reviews and feedback, absolutely critical and obvious to get into the mix. And we want to increase the density. We want to increase those interactions that take place. because by doing that, we're going to meet more people, we're going to network ourselves through the model, and we give ourselves more chances to get more feedback, and the feedback loop continues. And ultimately, tech is just there to drive real-world interactions. It's just there to drive better real-world interactions. So back to the anchor slide. I've hopefully just touched on the top two pillars there, the top two tenets. I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the other item, which I think is critical, which is this. So we are people, we're a bit special, many of us, myself included, a bit weird, but I want to sort of talk about attitude. So this guy, Dave Logan, I think I must have some sort of man crush on him because I keep referencing him, but I can't help myself. So Dave Logan has come up after reviewing 3+ million people across a number of years that there are 5 levels of attitude. And just a quick cheat on this, and please do Google the guy, that you've got 5 levels. So basically the bottom 3 levels, which represent 74% of a typical organization, could be company, could be network, could be alumni, doesn't matter, 74% aren't thinking about the we. They're thinking about, how can I get this? What do I want for myself? I'm not challenging that, but it's just a reality. The background of social psychology, I can spout about this for all day, but essentially, we have to think about, face into that reality. And what's interesting is you've got the 22%, the 22 to 24% at the top of the tree of collaboration that can't help themselves. I call it connecting Tourette's. And I think Emma is probably someone suffering from that wonderful affliction because you just can't help yourself. And if we think about empowering those people to do that very well, but we also think about nudging by a couple of percent the people who aren't naturally so inclined to collaborate, or perhaps have too much work on because the infrastructure, back to that old slide, isn't in place to motivate them and incentivize them, we have to think about these things. Again, the other thing about change, about ecosystems and evolving, is change. So we are, as human beings, absolutely hardwired to think about fear and worry, not reward. So why is it that the news is constantly all talking about bad things and scary things? It's because we like it, because it's like an addictive quality. So our role in terms of, as we expand the ecosystem and wanting to build into future business cases, we have to think about moving the gear and the atmosphere from fear and worry into one of reward and recognition. And it is a very, very enlightening move. And it's the same true for organizations. There's a new term emerging, which is the naked organization, the absolute paralyzed fear of organizations, because guess what? Someone might say something bad. And the Glassdoor team have done a great sort of, it's a baby step, but it's a very good step towards to start to open that up. And rather than hiding from it, we have to start to face into it. So with all that behind us, and just mulling those comments and those ideas, I wanted to sort of be brave enough to mention some sort of predictive ideas. And again, I'm just going to sort of remind the group, this is coming from working with hundreds of organizations, looking at the top academic thinking, and as that's changed as well, it's thinking about the change in what's happening in the boardrooms of all these mad, crazy, large companies, and what everyone is talking about. And so I'm picking on KPMG. We love KPMG, but it is a good example. And this is pretty much any company of any size like this. So you've got 180,000 people, quote unquote, that don't know each other. But you've got some amazing people there. What I find really interesting is there's over 300,000 people that used to work there or are part of the contingent workforce. So you've got 180,000 people in a firm that don't know each other. You've got 300,000 people that used to be there that love the brand that you don't know. And the money spent to recruit people that they already know is profound. The lost business opportunities is ludicrous, and the knowledge share is very poor. So if we could find a way to sync up the organization as it's defined itself at the moment, and include even the alumni who love the brand, amazing things will start to happen in terms of knowledge share, business development, and recruitment. So we call that Elastic Talent Pool 1.0. And we're already the thing's very exciting, but we're all a bit bored of it. What we're excited by is where it's going to head in a couple of years' time. So I would predict that in sort of 24 months, most firms will start to get their arms around their alumni. They'll start to massively impact recruitment on a profound level. But what is really interesting is 2.0. And 2.0 is the next evolution of thinking, is going back to the sort of Uberization of knowledge and thinking about empowering staff, not trying to own them. If we take that model to its natural sort of next step, then what we have to do, and by this is PowerPoint power. It took me about 10 minutes to figure out. And just for those, I'll do it one more time. I feel good now. It's actually to share it. If we take the logic forward, what we're talking about is sharing and empowering your people. So by definition, we have to get it into an environment with other brands that also want to do this. And those that don't, fine. Welcome to becoming the next Blockbuster and be the Kodak. Because these brands, and I know this for a fact firsthand, are very interested in thinking about sharing and empowering their people. And it doesn't have to be companies, it could be government, it could be parts of university. So if you're thinking about this model, we're talking about shared services pools, essentially and ultimately. So perhaps in sort of 5-6 years, and maybe thinking about exponential change, and I got it wrong, we have to think about months, not years. What we're really talking about is an amazing new home, back to our people there, a new place which is complementary to the fact that we know a lot of people are starting to think about the gig economy far more, the atomized thinking about people and work and knowledge and projects. And so a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, whether you're doing it today or will be doing it, won't be working in firms per se very soon. You'll be working with a portfolio career. And it's empowered, interestingly, by the companies themselves. Because if they don't do it, they're going to lose out. So sort of as I sort of start to come to a conclusion, I think the interesting thing as a philosophy is think about the journey of these people. And a great quote I quite like, which is, we who build the strategies of future businesses need to simply design ecosystems around the journey of our top talent. So where are they heading? How do we help them, not control them? How do we help them? And good things happen. And one way to think about the how behind that is around aligning win conditions. So this is stolen from gaming language, but essentially win conditions, you think about the organization as the construct that it is. You think about the divisional heads, those divisions as well. You've got to align those, and you've got to align them back with the actual end user, the individual. If you can thread that through, it's a win-win. Everybody's going to win. So back to our favorite, well, my favorite sort of mad number of 2.1. It's actually a little higher than that. Billion professionals that will be connected online by 2020. I sort of wanted to think about, do you want to be a sort of business in a bubble? Or do you want to be a sort of little hero? And I think the interesting thing about this slide, Zuckerberg, I'm not a massive fan of his, I have to be honest, but the, move fast and break things is a great quote. And I think the sort of 7 things to leave, if I can be so brave, look a bit like this. So be brave as organizations. Why aren't we thinking about machine learning and AI? Of course, I'm passionate about this area, but I just don't understand the logic. So of not doing it. So that's the first. The second is employee centricity. Absolutely, of course. We have to be more employee centric. We have to invest in currency of the trust. How do we use those moments? I'm not sure what that means. Perhaps get off the stage. I am nearly done. The currency of trust, strategic HR empowerment. Why and how has HR lost all the power when it's so important to business? We have to invest in that. We have to invest in the borderless and the gig economy. And as I said in the sort of penultimate side, just think about win conditions, aligning the corporate with the department, with the end user. And that's it.